Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Happy Guru Purnima, everybody. This is a solo follow-up video to our previous dialogue from the Samvadah series titled COVID, Institutional Lies and Buried Truths. So the reason I'm producing this addendum, so to speak, or a follow-up response is because there were a few questions that were asked after publishing the earlier video, and also to cover a couple of points that I believe we may have missed out discussing on, and to further condense and clarify my thoughts in a more approachable and understandable form, hopefully. So let's see if that is achieved. So before I get started, I just want to say that we are not giving a recommendation to anybody on whether you should get vaccinated or not. We are only asking the viewers to first recognize that there are valid arguments from both sides, and to also consider all sides of the issue in order to make your own informed choice. We are asking you to be skeptical of anyone who tries to silence any fact of the argument or any facet of the argument, and we request that you watch this video till the end and form your own conclusions. This may help inform you as well as people that you care for in your lives. So the other thing is that none of us, well, at least not myself, I'm not a medical practitioner. I don't have anything close to a doctor's degree. I am just a simple citizen who wishes to be informed. And this is our way of sharing our perspectives with the audience with the trust that they will make their own decisions as opposed to accept anything on blind faith. So when we started this channel, one of the goals was to disseminate information in a very truthful and honest way, and without having to hide behind the veil of political correctness or having to censor ourselves. So our goal today is simply to express our concerns and frustrations with the system and the way in which various institutions have handled this COVID, or rather mishandled this COVID crisis, and selectively prescribed certain solutions at the expense of others. So we are also going to discuss how these institutions have spread disinformation and kept truths hidden from the public, not accidentally, but very deliberately. And also because of the rampant censorship on part of our compromised social media, we'll have to maintain a separate copy of this video in case it gets taken down by the YouTube gods. Because my earlier posts on Facebook regarding COVID and Ayurvedic treatments had also been struck down, and I received a few warnings as well. So let's get started on that note. So what we'll be discussing today are the following. First is the immune system. Second is on vaccines and how they work. Third are the pros and cons of getting vaccinated. And I'll mostly be discussing the cons because there is already enough material in media, whether paid media or social media, that's addressing the pro side. So I'm only providing a counterbalance on the con side, not so much as recommending the con, but rather just balancing things out so that there is a fair narrative play out there. And also the fourth thing we'll be discussing is how institutions mishandled this pandemic and kept important information from the public. And also how they engage in blatant censorship and, to be honest, deception. And lastly, what are ways in which we can stop pandemic even outside of vaccination measures? And whether vaccines are the only way to do it is a question that we'll raise. So with these topics in mind, let's get started with the first one, which is how vaccines work. So first of all, why would a person get vaccinated? The reason to be vaccinated is to introduce a version of the virus that the body is able to recognize, and antibodies can be created in order to battle a future invader in terms of microorganism or pathogen that does infect the body. So vaccines are, in a sense, a preventive measure so that you're creating an immune response to battle a future threat, essentially speaking. Now, what are the different types of vaccines? We are exposed to four broad categories. If there are more, I'm sure somebody else would be better aware of it, but just, this is enough to get us started. The first kind of vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine, which is a weakened version of a virus that is introduced into your body, again, for your immune system to recognize the invader and to prepare for a future attack. The second type of vaccine is an inactivated vaccine, which is an inactivated version of the virus. So the first one was the weakened version, and this is a completely inactivated version of the virus. Now, of course, it would make sense that the inactivated version of the virus would call for a lesser immune response in your body because there's not so much fight in it as much as the live attenuated version. But depending on the situation, depending on the kind of vaccine and who it's being administered to, sometimes one may be more preferential than the other. The third is a viral vector, which is a modified version of the virus that's being introduced into your body. And the last one, which we haven't really heard of too much until the dawn of this pandemic, is the mRNA vaccine. So unlike the previous three vaccine categories, where some version of a virus is introduced into the body, in the mRNA vaccine, mRNA information is administered. It's at the vaccination site, usually the shoulder. From there, what happens is this mRNA enters our cellular structure, and over there, the cellular mechanism takes in the mRNA information and it uses that to encode the characteristic spiked protein of the coronavirus that we're familiar with. So if you've seen, imageries of the coronavirus, it usually shows this spherical kind of thing with spiked proteins all over its surface. So the spiky things that you see, those are the spike proteins. And so what exactly is a virus? It's a ball of information which is in the form of RNA, which is coated by a protein capsid. So the protein capsid is something that prevents the information, the genetic information of the virus, the insides of the virus from spilling out. So it's kind of a protective shell. But what really constitutes a virus, the main thing of the virus is the mRNA inside. And when a virus infects your cell, it doesn't replicate as you would expect typical reproduction to take place. Rather, it programs your own cell to create copies of the virus by injecting its own genetic information into the nucleus of your cell, and your cell becomes a factory to produce that virus. So the same way the mRNA, what it does is its information is used to produce the spike proteins, which are characteristic of the COVID-19. Okay. So these are the four different versions of the virus. Now, there are arguments to suggest that uh, um, vaccinations are most effective prior to a global pandemic and not so much during a pandemic. And there is some evidence to be offered in this direction. So, for instance, let's say when we talk about the evolution of a microorganism, a pathogen, the goal of evolution can be simply put as follows. A species that survives through the generations and through the populations is ahead in the evolutionary race. And what I mean by that is, let's take any population, any species for that matter. The goal of every species is twofold. One is to spread horizontally by increased number of populations, and second is vertically through time. So a species is successful if it can subsist for many generations without going extinct. A species that becomes extinct is not considered evolutionarily fit. So when Charles Darwin talked about survival of the fittest, this is what he meant. The fitness is the evolutionary fitness to survive and pass its genes down through the various generations. So now you would expect that if a virus had to evolve and it had to succeed, it's an open question. Would you think that the virus that is most successful is a very deadly virus, or a rather not exactly harmless, but less harmful virus? And the answer is the latter. Think about it this way. If a virus were considered to be an evolutionary success, but if it infected you and very quickly you fell sick and you died, its chance of spreading to other people around within that population would be very low, because you would immediately become immobile. You would be isolated to your room or hospital bed or whatever, and there wouldn't be much chance for you to spread that contagion to other people. So therefore, that doesn't really scream out success. But a virus which is relatively, say, less infectious, or not less infectious, but less deadly and less fatal, is more successful than the one that is fatal, because there is a greater chance of you still being up and about, moving around, going to work, visiting places, and spreading that virus to other people as well. Because the goal of the virus isn't to kill you. The goal of any species is to survive. Killing you may or may not be, part of its plan. I mean, it doesn't really have a plan as such, but certainly its goal would be to survive, because that's what accounts for the fitness. So a classic example of a really fit virus over here is the common cold, which is the rhinovirus, which is again very similar, similar family as the coronavirus. So the rhinovirus, which is the common cold that we get every damn season, it is just annoying enough to give you the sniffles and maybe watery eyes and a little bit of a sinus headache. You'll just be a bit irritated, but it's not going to put you out in any major way, and you'll still be up and about, and you might sneeze on somebody and you might cough, and then guess what, that other person falls sick. And so in some sense the common cold has been very successful, because it's almost impossible to eradicate, and secondly, nobody pays so much attention to it that nobody's going to create a vaccine to cure the common cold. First of all, it's very difficult to cure because it has spread so far and wide, that it's there in every single part of the earth. And arguably, we don't know the numbers, but I mean, it's pretty widespread. Everybody has had the common cold at least several times in their life, if not several times a year. So now, if you think about it, the common cold is successful. But then take the opposite end of the spectrum, which is something very fatal, such as the Ebola. And for those who remember a couple of years back when Ebola really entered the news, everybody was deathly afraid of it because it was extremely fatal. But it didn't really become a pandemic, much less did it become an epidemic. And the reason Ebola didn't really go very far is for precisely the reason we spoke about. That is, it kills the host very quickly. I mean, the survival rate, I don't really remember, but it's extremely low. If you have Ebola, you better start praying, because chances of you surviving are not very high. So Ebola didn't do really well. Now coronavirus is unique because it's not as bad as Ebola in terms of its fatality rates, but it's not as great as the common cold. It's somewhere in between. And um, for some weird, inexplicable reason, every strain of the coronavirus that we see has been deadlier than the previous one, which may not always make sense, and one would wonder why. Now, there is there's a famous researcher called, I believe his name is Vanden Geert Hooft, who's a Dutch scientist, and he did mention that vaccinations during a pandemic may not be a good idea, because they may create scope for deadlier mutants of the virus to be produced. And there is good evidence to see why this is the case, because, well, it's already out there. Every single variant of the coronavirus has been more infectious and more fatal than the previous version. In fact, even the first original COVID-19, the original strand, was not very common amongst children and infants. But the more recent versions have also begun to infect like younger people. So think about it this way. Imagine that you have, excuse me, a petri dish in a biology lab, and in that petri dish, you are culturing some microorganism which is suspended in a solution that it really thrives within. So it could be a glucose solution or something that it eats, that it grows within. Now, it's very happy growing there in that petri dish because it's feeding on its favorite food. And imagine that you begin acidifying that solution. You start adding more and more acidity to it, and you are altering its pH balance. And then, as you keep altering its pH balance, more and more particles of, well, for lack of a better word, particles of that microorganism begin to die out. And so you introduce some change in the pH balance, maybe 20% of the population dies out. You introduce some more, maybe 70% dies out. You keep introducing more and more changes in the pH balance until maybe there's just a couple of percent of that original population of the microorganism still alive. Now what happens is it is that original, the surviving population that begins to thrive in that new environment, but all the other um, individuals within that population that couldn't stand that changed environment begin to die out. In fact, they die out. So a common misconception that people have about evolution is that they somehow think that individuals evolve, and after some sort of environmental exposure, it is the individual who comes back as a stronger individual or a more evolved individual. Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. And the way populations evolve is by the extinction of an evolutionarily unfit population. So this is one thing to keep in mind. It's a very important core concept of how evolution works. Now imagine the same dish experiment, but expanded, and now you are extrapolating it to the whole world. And now we think about it from the context of the pandemic. Now all these people, individuals who have been exposed to the vaccine during a pandemic, what ends up happening is that you are still able to shed a viral load. So even though you're vaccinated, you will still be able to shed that same virus to somebody else, though to a lesser degree, no doubt about that. But still, you will be able to shed it. What happens is for the people who are vaccinated and then they get the coronavirus, they get infected by COVID. Should really call it the Wuhan virus, and we'll talk about that later. But the ones who are infected by the coronavirus, the vaccine is able to protect them to a very large extent. Uh, then, through some random mutations, those individual particles of the coronavirus, which aren't getting killed off by your immune response, they are the ones that survive. And because they survive, they may not be in any large number to still kill you, because you killed off the majority of the COVID invaders, but there are still some left. And the ones which are left behind are the hardier, the deadlier, mutated version of the COVID. Now, when that passes on to somebody else, it's not the weakened version of the virus, but it's those fewer, deadlier strains that still remain that's passed on to somebody else. And then that becomes the dominant version because the weakened version or the weaker version begins to die off because the vaccine is doing what it's supposed to do, but it's not doing the complete job because there's no such thing as a perfect vaccine. There's no 100% cure. And so this is one reason why it is suggested that vaccinations may not be the best strategy for the population during a pandemic crisis. It may be better used as a preventive measure, because when you're doing it during the pandemic, you're giving it a very large playground upon which to evolve, and far greater probabilistic chances for that evolutionary process to spit out a deadlier strain. So this is one very solid argument, and whether it's true or not is a separate matter. At least it makes sense. It's convincing enough. So I'm not saying that this is the absolute truth, but it's at least worth keeping in mind before people go all gung ho about how vaccines are the miracle drug that's going to cure this whole pandemic. We need to think twice about the latter if after effects as well. So there's repercussions for everything, and we need to think about this. Excuse me, I have a little sore throat. Now, if we think about the immune response of the body, let's say a person that has not been vaccinated, certainly it's more difficult for the antibodies of an unvaccinated person to recognize COVID when it strikes you. That is true. There is some merit to that. And therefore, for the individual, it may just be a better idea to get that vaccine shot. So there is a 70, 80, 90, 95% chance of you being protected against an actual invasion. Now, unfortunately, every single um, iteration of a viral strain is less prone to being eradicated by the vaccine. So already there's talk about, for instance, there's already talk about the Delta variant being less susceptible to the vaccines as the original variants, or not the original variants, but as the original strand. So again, one should ask the question that how effective are these vaccines going to be for increasingly mutated and deadlier versions of the virus? And at what point will the effectiveness um, be nullified by the potential side effects, which are yet to be explored? But one side effect is that it could weaken the body's immune response as follows. Imagine that we typically talked about um, the traditional vaccines. You talk about the live attenuated vaccine, the inactivated vaccine, the viral vector vaccine. Now, in all of those instances, you're injecting a version of the virus that the body's antibodies learn, not the antibodies, but your immune system learns to recognize and generates an antibody response based on recognizing those characteristics. Now, for the mRNA, what it's trying to recognize is not the shape or form of the virus itself, but rather of the spike proteins. Now, in some sense, you may think that a virus is more genetic than the given characteristics of a virus. I'm sorry, a virus is more generic than the given characteristics of that virus. So that means that you could still have the same coronavirus, which may have similar characteristics as another coronavirus, but may have quite distinct spike protein structures. So, because your body has learned to recognize a certain structure, which is the spike proteins, if there's a mutation of the coronavirus which comes along with a different S protein structure, your body will not be able to recognize it. And not only that, but your autoimmune system, even without any vaccination, may potentially be better equipped to deal with that invader than uh, your body after having been vaccinated to recognize a different invader altogether. So let me give you the following example. When a person gets infected by COVID, it's not one or two or three or 50 different individual COVID particles that infect you, because your body is able to fend those off. But when the COVID infects you, there's a certain viral load, a certain threshold in terms of numbers that it has to cross before your body cannot handle it anymore, and then your body loses, or at least you get infected by COVID until that cycle is over, or until you die, or until COVID gets eradicated from your body. One of the two happen. Now, what happens is, imagine that we have this autoimmune response. Now, take the analogy of India, the Indian army. Suppose it has been informed of an attack coming from Pakistan. What it's going to do is deploy all of its soldiers to the Kargil border, the India-Pakistan border. And over there, it's going to stand in wait for the enemy to arrive. But what happens if the enemy comes from Bangladesh? What if Bangladesh attacks? So in this case, the time it would take for the soldiers to disperse themselves from just within the center of the nation, either to Pakistan or to Bangladesh, would take less time than for them to go from the Pakistan front to the Bangladesh front. Now, of course, this is not a great example, but it's at least one way to visualize it. So, what I'm trying to say is your body has an innate immune response. And because that immune response has now been, you can say, trained to recognize a certain invader, it will create antibodies to that effect, which will leave less antibodies available to fend off other very different variations of COVID. And not only that, but even potentially other illnesses, such as pneumonia or anything else that you're infected by. So your body is less available to fight off those infections because it has geared itself, it has prepared itself to fight a certain variation of the COVID virus. So, in some sense, one may argue that your immune response can be compromised. Excuse me again. Now, the other thing is also that if a person talks about being vaccinated themselves, it's not that they are creating a complete threat just for the individual, but it's more of a threat for the population. So this is really one of those paradoxes about looking out for the well-being of the community as opposed to the well-being of the individual, or the individual at the cost of the community, and vice versa. So even if, let's say, if I were protected because I took the vaccine, but there is still a probability that because I took the vaccine, I'm protected, but the viral load that I shared would be the mutated version of it also. And that may spread through the population and ultimately create a crisis down the line. So then there are many reasons to suggest that coronavirus vaccines may not be the best. This may not be the best time to administer because we are going through a pandemic, but we should do it between, um, let's say, prior to uh, a wave. Maybe that's a better time to do it. So let's say between the second wave and the third wave, that might be a good period for everybody to get vaccinated, as opposed to get vaccinated during the second wave, which a lot of people did. And again, there is no solution to this because in a field called systems dynamics, there is something called a wicked problem. And the reason it's called a wicked problem is because there is no perfect solution. There are only ways in which you can improve upon the situation. You can never completely eliminate the problem. The problem will always be there. You just have to decide, um, where you want to lay your chips and where you would want to see the repercussions as opposed to in a different place. So it's about minimizing the problem without creating negative externality somewhere else to the extent possible. It's not a perfect solution. So questions as to whether should we get vaccinated or not are very difficult to answer because there are not enough facts out there. And even we are grappling with it. Having given this so much thought, I still cannot come up with a perfect recommendation for anybody, but I still implore everyone that come up with your own understanding of the problem, ask questions, and arrive at your own solution based on your intuition and your own common sense. So anyway, now even coming to the whole development of vaccines, and when we talk about the institutions, usually vaccines are developed over a period of 7 to 10 years. Granted that for COVID, there was greater urgency. So there were greater resources, more capital, more people working on it. So there could be a quicker solution. But still, we got a vaccine out in a year. And then, we see certain numbers floating about, such as, oh, by the way, this vaccine is going to be X% effective over a period of a year. How do they calculate a year? I was speaking to just in this prior conversation with my co-host Viduleka, and we were discussing the whole idea about how statistics can be used against people who don't think too much, because people like being told by authorities that something is X% effective and therefore they will accept it at face value. But if a vaccine has not been tested for a year, how can we know whether it's going to last for a year or not? At the same time, when I was speaking with her, she has been infected by COVID at least once, and yet, you would be surprised to hear that people who have even been infected by COVID are still asked to take vaccines. When you would expect your body's natural immune response to already create antibodies based on your earlier COVID infection, but still these people are asked to take vaccines to produce the same result, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And one of the justifications they give is that the vaccine will be effective for a year, whereas if you've been infected by COVID, the antibodies will last only for 3 months. There is not a lot of statistical evidence to support all of these statements, but people still make it and people accept it because it comes from some place of authority. Now, that is worth questioning. I'm not saying it's true or it's false. I'm just saying it's worth inquiring into. We have a right to understand more, and we have a responsibility to ask the right questions. Okay, so now the other thing is that every institution that has been promoting vaccinations pretend as though vaccinations are the only silver bullet to put an end to the whole pandemic. They have not allowed for other alternative remedies to even be entertained, much less administered. So, to give you an example, there were certain, there's a certain distinction between a clinical study and a population study. A clinical study essentially happens in a lab. A population study just happens in the broader population. It's more organic and there's a greater sample size involved there as well. So every single recommendation and every single research that has come out in favor of the vaccine has by and large been in the context of clinical studies. But there is a certain drug called ivermectin, which people have found some population studies to point towards evidence that it is an effective prophylactic as in a preventive measure against the COVID, and it is also helpful as a treatment. Now, one of my uncles also, and his whole family really, they all got infected, and they received ivermectin, and they were fine in due course. There wasn't any major issue with it. Of course, this is an anecdotal evidence. It's not a statistical, statistically significant number that I'm talking about. But at the same time, when ivermectin had been administered to nursing homes and elderly homes in France, and they compared the impact of those patients who had been administered with this ivermectin drug compared to other nursing homes, they found the COVID rates to be significantly lower, in fact, almost negligible. Also, this complete idiot of a chief minister, the communist Stalin in Tamil Nadu, he banned ivermectin, or at least he made it very difficult for people to procure. And we see COVID cases skyrocketing in Tamil Nadu. Whereas the Goa chief minister and Yogi Adityanath ji from UP, they supported ivermectin, and cases were relatively kept in check in those two states and Union Territory and state respectively. So there is enough evidence to suggest that ivermectin is a good drug. Even in Mexico, like it has been used by a lot of people, and Mexico being a more populated nation than even the United States and more densely populated for that matter, things are still better over there. The situation never really escalated to the way it did in the United States. So one would almost think that with all of this evidence, okay, not proof, but evidence pointing in the direction of ivermectin being a good drug, why the hell are we not um, prescribing it to more people just as a safety? Because it's been around in the market for a very long time for us to know that there are not any crazy or harmful side effects of taking that drug, and it's worthwhile taking the risk. And here's the reason why these complete lunatics have not promoted ivermectin. And the reason is it's a generic drug. There's nobody making money out of it. There's no money trail involved. There's no single institution that's able to profit from the sales of ivermectin. But at the same time, when it comes to Pfizer, it comes to Moderna, Johnson and Johnson, Covaxin, Covishield, all of these things, there are institutions and there's big money that's promoting all of these things. So whether we talk about it in terms of governments or media institutions, even social media for that matter, everything is interlinked because there is a very good lobby for these big pharma companies, and all the research that is funded. There are certain things that I know that I cannot speak of, unfortunately, because, well, I just cannot, and maybe I'll explain why separately. But there's a lot of let's say a lot of the research that is in favor of the COVID vaccines that are in vogue at the moment are themselves funded by these big giant corporations. They are not doing it out of charity. So while there could be another alternative such as ivermectin, that they are vociferously and speaking out against, and they are not, there's nobody funding research along those lines. And even the doctors and the certain brave individuals who do speak about it, their voices are completely shut down and they are being cancelled from different platforms. Doctors are losing their medical licenses. This is one thing I really wanted to speak about, which is when we discuss the role of a doctor, I believe it is first and foremost meant to be the role of an investigator or a researcher or somebody who uses their deep intuition and a lifelong vision that is shaped by all the knowledge that they've accumulated throughout their lives and throughout their medical careers and their educational background. But nowadays, doctors are forced to follow certain protocols set forth by the institutions, not just on how you should treat a certain patient, but how much dosage you should prescribe, and the exact like unit measurements and all of these things. So doctors have begun to lose their autonomy. They don't have their own independent thinking or voice anymore, and that's very dangerous because we are taking away that autonomy from medical practitioners, which I believe is part and parcel of their profession. And there used to be a time when we were little kids, when doctors used to make house calls, and it was a very common thing, even for small things. If you had a small um, I don't know, small wound and you needed to be stitched or something of that sort, doctors used to come home. Or if you had some illness, if you had asthma, anything of that sort, doctors would come and they would prescribe a treatment, and then they would kind of ask questions. That has become lesser and lesser over time. Now house calls are only made during absolute emergencies like life and death situations, or even that's become rare now. So doctors used to come home, and then they used to use their own brains, which they still have, but they're not using anymore because they're not allowed to use it. And they would look at the environment, the vatavaran. They would look at the kind of water that is flowing, the quality of the water, the quality of the air. They would figure out things about your background. They would know your family history. They would know you as a person. And now it's all become a very robotic, mechanical profession, and they're just given instructions as to, if this person has COVID, this is how you should treat them. Now, of course, there are certain things such as best practices, but best practices cannot replace common sense. And if you go against those best practices, you may lose your medical license, and that's a very dangerous thing to have dedicated your whole life for, and then having to lose that suddenly. You're out on the road. So what choices do these doctors have anyway? So anyway, the situation is very difficult, and even the doctors who wish to prescribe ivermectin are being dissuaded from doing so, and they've been threatened by these major institutions from playing the role of a doctor, which is to be first and foremost an investigator. So these are some things I wanted to discuss, and excuse me, the uh, there was a question that somebody asked: should I get vaccinated? It would be criminal on my part to say yes or no, because the truth is that none of us, myself included, and I would also like to say quite likely some of the big players in this field, don't completely know what's going on. We haven't seen something like this before. We haven't had exposure to mass vaccinations during a pandemic to the extent we see right now. Everything is new for us. A lot of things are new for us, at least. So there are so many unknown variables, and there are so many lurking variables, that it would be very difficult for us to create um, a blueprint solution for everyone. What I would say is, if you are elderly, if you are, I don't know, I'm just throwing a number out because who knows, right? But let's say if you're above the age of 50 or 60, it would be safer for you to get vaccinated because you may have a compromised immune system. And if you are a kid, if you're a child, and they've not released the vaccines for kids yet, or like toddlers and such, but if you were one and if they did release vaccines, I would discourage you from taking it, because I think your immune response, it's better that you let your innate immune response handle it. Or even if you're a teenager for that matter. For somebody like me in my early 30s, probably I wouldn't prescribe getting vaccinated. I received both shots of my vaccine, but this was before I did a lot of my research. And if I had to really do it right now, I'm not completely sure what I would do. And that's the honest answer. It's not a, this video is not a prescription. It's more of a conversation with all of you. And that's one thing I wanted to quickly put out, that I have received my vaccine shots, but having known what I know now and having asked the questions to myself that I'm asking at this moment, I don't know if I would take the shots. I don't know for sure. So there's no easy answer to that. Now, um, the other thing that really troubled me, this was during the start of the pandemic, is the complete incompetence, the utter bungling of the World Health Organization. First of all, it was stupid of them to not prescribe social distancing at the onset, like right at the beginning, not when things are bad enough that you need to keep people home, but before they got bad enough. Like they should have just gone ahead and prescribed that, at least in the United States and Europe, because it got bad later on in India, not so much during the first wave. But the first wave, when it hit Italy and Spain, and later on to the US. The US had enough time. Now, because I live in the US, so I'll speak a bit more about America, that it had enough time to see the complete chaos that COVID had wreaked in those European states. And so they knew that this is going to happen. Why not take precautions earlier on? Because you already have a sample. They say that a wise person learns from their experience, but a wiser person learns from somebody else's experience. And US is neither wise nor much less wiser. It's utterly stupid what the way the administration handled the situation. The other thing was, we all know, I mean, there's a very, very, very high likelihood, 95% or something, that the coronavirus originated from the Wuhan lab in China. Now, whether it was designed as a bioweapon or whether it was an accidental escape is besides the point. Uh, the point is that it very, very likely escaped from the Wuhan lab. They were studying bats, and the first incidents of the coronavirus were recorded even in the Wuhan province. If you put two and two together, it's like screaming with a marquee sign that's flashing saying coronavirus originated here. So because for some reason it's become taboo to criticize China because the left doesn't really like it, whether it's the Democratic Party in the US or the Indian left, they are in complete love with China for reasons that we know very well, that it's a communist nation, and communism and leftism are more or less the same thing. So therefore, criticizing China was not allowed, and you would have your post struck down, your videos taken down. All of these things happen. They happen to me also. They happen to a lot of other people I know as well. But now suddenly, there is again growing evidence that the virus did indeed escape from the Wuhan lab. But suddenly, Facebook and other social media giants have never rendered an apology to any of us for calling this out over a year ago. In fact, we got penalized for these for doing these things. So this is a completely different discussion, but I do want to discuss it in the future, maybe in a separate solo session or with my co-host, about freedom of speech and the role of social media and so on and so forth. But so I'll not get too much into that. The second thing is, uh, these imbeciles took a very long time to prescribe the wearing of masks. Now, the studies that they were doing, so-called studies, were to figure out the effectiveness of masks during a pandemic, or during just to prevent COVID. Let's put it that way. It doesn't take much common sense to know that if I'm wearing a shirt and if somebody splashes coffee or water on me, the shirt is going to absorb quite a bit of it before it touches my skin. So if their goal was to figure out how effective the mask is, common sense tells me that it will be greater than 0%, right? It will not be 0% effective. At least it will be a number higher than zero, even if it's not 100%. And so they should have just gone ahead and prescribed masks for everybody very earlier on. They should have mass produced it, or they should have imported from every place that they could. But they delayed this. And because they did not truly share this common sense argument that wearing a mask, however effective it is still going to be at least a little effective. dissuaded a lot of people from wearing masks. And they came up with completely baseless arguments about whether masks are truly effective or not. And that would have led, I'm sure, to a lot more COVID spreading than it would have otherwise. So, in some sense, this was completely criminal negligence of the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control in the US, which kept trying to figure out whether masks are X% effective. And so I hate saying this, but the people in my nation, in the United States, are so stupid about this matter, at least, that they will believe what the authority says about the weather instead of sticking their hand outside the window to figure out whether it's raining or not. They will wait for the weather report to confirm that it's raining before they actually believe that their hand is wet. And this happened during the COVID crisis as well. When people said the mask is mandated, some people started wearing masks. A few weeks ago, or I think a month ago, the CDC again lifted the restriction saying that you don't need to wear masks indoor anymore. And everybody stopped wearing the mask. If you go to the grocery store, you'll not see people wearing the mask, at least in the city that I live. And this happened almost overnight because people are crazily prone to following authority. And if the authority says something, they'll do it. If the authority doesn't say, they'll not do it. So this is a very dangerous situation when people are not thinking enough. They're not inquisitive enough to figure out, what is the right thing to do. So one of the concerns that I really had is people are being divided into the pro-vaccination camp and the anti-vaccination camp. And each side is kind of throwing projectiles at each other, trying to call the other one crazy. And because the narrative is won by the pro-vaccine side, which is run by the media and the social media houses and the big companies and the institutions, there are some of us who are neither pro nor anti-vaccine. We are somewhere in between because we are still thinking and we are still trying to figure out what's right or wrong. We are being clubbed into certain categories and our voices are being shut. So, for instance, maybe a month or 2 months ago, I made a post on social media about about Ayurveda not only being used as a preventive measure, but also suggested that we should do some research about how Ayurveda can be used to treat illnesses, and particularly, if it can help abate the coronavirus problem as well. And that post got stricken down by Facebook for going against community standards. So these people speak about algorithms. So whenever you point a finger about the social media censorship bias, they say, okay, look, we are not doing anything. It's our algorithm that's flagging your content. But how come the algorithm learns to recognize certain words and only curb certain voices and not others? So obviously, when you have an algorithm, you are providing it with training data and you're setting its hyperparameters. This is a separate discussion we'll have, but I just want to introduce this idea that you have hyperparameters of an algorithm which learns to recognize, and you're training your model, your classification model in a certain way, and so it can flag a post as either violated content or regular content. And there has to be a programmer behind the program, so somebody is accountable to it. But because the algorithm functions as a black box, they can get away with it, and this is something that needs to be checked as well. So now, when it comes to the vaccine and what could be some of the long-term repercussions, but again, as mentioned, vaccines take 7 to 10 years to develop, and then you have studies on, unfortunately, on animals and on human populations and such. And then it takes years and years and years for certain side effects to be known. Just take the example of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The radiation illness and the radiation defects that caused genetic problems in the offsprings of the affected people in the area where the bombs were dropped, those were only known after a generation. So, there is some study. Now, there are studies, and these studies have been debunked, and these debunked studies have further been debunked, and there's back and forth, and there's all sorts of arguments. So, I'm not quoting this as the truth. What I'm saying is that there was a study done by Japan where they found that the spike protein of the coronavirus, which was only supposed to be isolated in the shoulder region where you get the shot, it had traveled to other parts of the body in small numbers, such as the ovaries, and I don't remember, but something related to the heart, but I don't remember exactly. But it traveled to other parts of the body, at least the ovaries. Now, what impact it would have on the reproductive health of women, we don't know it. And this is something that we'll have to perform population studies on several generations down to truly figure out, because sometimes genetic defects skip a generation and they affect the next generation. So maybe a person who's vaccinated, their grandchild may have the problem, but the child may not have the problem, and they may not have the problem. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is worth considering, and we need to again do further research on all of these fronts as well. So uh, a lot of these things that we speak about or that we ask questions about are terms as conspiracy theories, and I am trained just based on my adhyatmic experience, the study of Shastra, the way I've related to the world, the way I try to create models for the way reality works, is that I don't see anything as black and white. I don't see anything as ones and zeros or yes and no's. So, can one say for a fact that vaccinations are the problem? You can't say yes or you can't say no either. All you can say is that there could be certain pros and certain cons, and it is up to each individual to weigh what those are and allow further research to be done in order to decide whether the scales are tilting. And the way to do this is not by curbing or curtailing a certain voice, which is the anti-vaccine voice, but to allow that to be uh, uh, demonstrably put forward to subject itself to negation. So let's say if I make a statement, I should have the right to make a statement, even if my statement is wrong, so that somebody else can debunk it and there can be greater clarity in the overall scheme of things. But when you become a dictator and you start, only encouraging certain voices while curtailing other voices, not only are you taking away the freedom of the speech of the individual who wishes to have a say in the matter, but you're also depriving the individuals who wish to hear that opinion from doing so. So it impacts both the speaker and the listener. And so every single argument should be treated as sacrosanct, and it should be put out in the public domain. And then counter arguments should be put forth and allow common sense, logic, rationale, evidence, and if possible, proofs to prevail. So that should be the approach in dealing with the pandemic. So I am very hesitant to call something a conspiracy. Rather, I assign percentages to things before I decide that they are a conspiracy or not. For example, let's say, what is the probability that the American government is hiding UFOs in Area 41? I believe, I forget the name of the area, but there's a certain area where they say that the US government is hiding secrets about UFO landings and such. I would say, is it completely impossible? No, but there's a very very small possibility that that may be true, but it is so small that I probably don't care to think about it. But at the same time, there might be a possibility that this the virus escaped from China, and there could be a smaller possibility that it was used as a bioweapon. How negligible it is up for the public to decide based on discussions and articulated arguments back and forth. But one cannot completely snub an argument and say that this is a complete conspiracy theory, because just as we ask for evidence for something to be a conspiracy theory, we need to ask for evidence for the contrary as well. So initially, people said that the origin of the coronavirus from the Wuhan lab was a conspiracy theory, but now it has become mainstream and no longer tagged as a conspiracy. So what we call a conspiracy and what we don't changes with the time, and it changes with the evidence. So I try to err on the side of accepting that there might be more conspiracies valid than the public is prone to give that quote unquote conspiracy credit for, because there might be some truth to it that gets revealed down the line. And so we have to keep our ears open, we have to keep our eyes open, we have to keep our minds open, and we have to watch out for the evidence. And based on the evidence, we can decide. So I just wanted to make this video again to clarify some of my thoughts from the earlier discussion, to add a few follow-up points. and also to condense um, my my perspective, because I may not have completely spelled it out as clearly as I did right now. So, having said that, I will take your leave, and Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, whatever form of social media you are, if you are hearing this, if you're watching this, um, if this video gets taken down, it'll just be posted elsewhere, because I've had that negative experience with social media, and I don't appreciate it. But at the same time, our voice is ours and it doesn't belong to anybody else. And I think we have a right to speak, and you have a right to hear. So I thank the audience for listening, and for giving me the opportunity to present these thoughts. And at the end of the day, I would implore you that whatever it is that you decide, please use your rationale, and come up with a fair and balanced decision, not based on what I or anybody else says, but just based on what makes sense. And whatever makes sense will only make sense in the moment. You don't know the future, because information that hasn't come out. So you can only make the best decision that you can. And on that, I'll take your leave. Hari Om Shri Guru Namaha. Om.